I hope you are okay if I maybe start with the first question for our 4 presenters here, which is hopefully not too provocative, but I would be really interested to hear you, what you think about. What I noticed is that in most of your presentations, you mentioned in one or the other way that practitioners very often are already seeing through the lens of service-dominant logic. However, many of them have probably never heard of it up to now, but they're doing it anyway. So my question would be, if they are already doing it rather intuitively, why should we still teach them service-dominant logic? Or why is it then important to have such a theoretical framework? So who of you would like to give an answer first? Yeah, Michael.
Some are doing better, some are doing worse. We just closed down one of the largest companies in Germany yesterday. And I think because some of these CEOs, especially the last one, not before, the one before Ike, he was not really thinking in the terms of service dominant logic. Because if you can see what is happening in the retail market and you're still running these businesses, I think there's something went wrong. So this kind of understanding and the thinking about value creation and the thinking in the so to say in the minds of the customer is something that is missing. So there are some that are very, very successful. Christian talked about some examples from B2B marketing and changing B2B markets into B2 service to business markets, so to say. So there are many, many examples of companies. They are very insightful, and they really try to understand the value chain or the value production, so to say, or the value creation from what I know more, even better, is within a customer's company. In B2B area, there are many companies very successful in trying to understand the business model of the customer. That means, and then try to provide something, a product or a service that helps them to get this value out of their own value creation processes. So there are some which are very successful and they know it and they do it intuitively. Maybe they have read some books, maybe they went to university, whatever, but others don't. So, so I think there is still a need to do this even better and to hopefully get a better understanding. And maybe we can come back on this end to Adam Smith when talking about the wealth of nations. I think this is this kind of perspective is also maybe, or the usage of this perspective may be something to be more compatible as a country or as a company or even as a country compared to others, and so to help to increase the wealth of nations. So maybe this is something that also can be related with these very beginnings, what Steve said in his presentation.
I could continue from that if I may. I of course agree with what Michael says here, but I would also add that business practitioners are not thinking about service logic or service dominant logic. If they are, they're thinking about symptoms of that. They're talking about we need, to these days, it's about to turn products into services, they say. And we need to look at our products as processes, some say. And customers are looking for service. But there's no logic behind that. The logic behind that, if you go further, as we've done into the thinking of business people, is still very much goods-based. So there's a lot teaching to do, I'd say, yes. And the good examples that Michel gave here, of course, are those who either gone deeper into this, has seen the business logic a little bit differently or perhaps even largely differently than the goods-based logic. Or then pure luck, have been doing well. And those who have not been doing well, it's either the business situation that was impossible, you couldn't have done something, or then really that you couldn't shift the logic. So I think there's a lot of teaching to do to practitioners today. So why are you thinking, why are you saying we need to turn products into services? Why are you saying so? What does it really mean? What's the theoretical thinking behind that? Why is it so that this is a correct conclusion, we need to turn the products into services. And then, of course, coming to business schools and universities, we're teaching those of you who are the future practitioners and managers. And in most, if not all, business schools, we are teaching everything in the wrong way these days, still. That's not a story. We are teaching goods logic, by the way.
Would you like to add to this?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Everybody wants to speak.
I think there's sometimes some misunderstanding, including among academics, about what academics do. We don't so much sit around and dream up theories and therefore have something to say to practitioners. We have more tendency to watch practitioners through their normal practices, which often is done intuitively and iteratively and learning as they go and discovering what works in real systems driven kinds of worlds, but they don't necessarily know why it worked. And our job is interpretation more, to see if we can take something that happens in a specific situation, in a specific context, and turn it, to abstract it into generalizable terms, so we can go teach somebody else how to benefit from the same successes or mistakes. And so we do translation and coordination in a large sense, more than just theorizing and develop theories to teach from the top down. It's probably much more bottom up than we think it is.
I would like to add 2 points here. The one is about teaching and the other is about science. For me, teaching is enabling the learner to learn. So we have to look onto the learner. If practitioners learn, and if they want to be aware of what they are doing, they often do it intuitively. And what we can help to do them is to reflect on what they do and to think about new forms, to evaluate their doings and to reflect their doing, to figure out why they are successful if they don't know, and why they are perhaps not successful. So that is very important. Learning means to reflect on what I have experienced. The second thing is about science. Well, as far as I can think, I would guess that the Earth has ever been surrounding the Sun and not the other way around. But we have not always known that. And the same is here with the service-dominant logic. Yes, we discover things, and then it's helpful to use them for getting better.
Yeah, that's right. If you allow me a second question, which is closely connected to what some of you already said, because we are here in the university and you are all teachers or professors, and in our auditorium there are a lot of students. And today you were talking about service-dominant logic. What do you think when these students go into practice to start with their first jobs? What could be their benefit from learning something about service-dominant logic when they start with their first jobs? What do you think?
You could really make a difference in the firm, provided that you get into a firm which is open for new thoughts. I mean, most students, when they graduate, get into a firm that's not open for new thoughts. Mm-hmm. And then you have to fight for your new ideas and muddle them through successfully or not successfully, or then give in and try to find another employer. But you have the opportunity to make the change happen. That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to add something?
Yes,
yeah?
of course. Well, of course, yeah.
That's the right way of asking.
The interesting point for me is first, let's start with the situation you are in. And this situation is what we call in Germany Studium, okay? Which means in German, simply, if you go back to the Latin, Eifer. Keep that Eifer, first of all. Second point is, this studium should be of interest, which comes from the Latin word interesse, which means be in between. Whatever you do, be in between, be a part of it. And if you continue that, that is very helpful. Now, I would add a point from a social constructionist perspective. We typically do something with you which I'm trying to change in Leipzig. We typically give you the impression that in marketing and accounting and organization and human resource management, there are very, very, very specific meanings of the words. And only these meanings are the true meanings. If you are aware that different people have different meanings, it's much more easier to coordinate with others for the things you want to achieve.
Okay, thank you. So I would now like to ask all the people in the auditorium to ask their questions. I'm sure they are many of them, because we heard 4 very interesting presentations. Yeah, Anja Geigenmüller, please.
First of all, thank you for this fantastic perspective on the logic. For more better questions, does our service logic mean that we need more or new capabilities of managers to keep? Does this service logic mean that we need more or different capabilities of managers to run more service-oriented businesses? Do we have the right capabilities of our students or managers to run these businesses? Or does this kind of teaching aspect also involve that we have to rethink about creating new skills and knowledge, especially because we see with our experiences and not with our eyes?
Well, if I may answer that question first, from my experience, more and more, the more enlightened business people, in the sense enlightened as seeing that there is a new thinking, a new attitude of mind really involved here, they say, this is hopeless, we need a new generation that will do it. This just is an indication that it's very, very difficult. Of course, it's not hopeless, but these people have been fighting so much internally with other managers on various levels to make them realize that maybe you should think a little bit differently about what we are doing, how we should be thinking about what we're doing, and so forth. So that's why they say this is hopeless. But it's a huge change that not comes easily, and I guess it's going to be described to some extent by Helge's. I guess I'm doing the wrong thing when I'm talking with Michel and Helge. I'm in Germany now. Professor Klein-Autenkamp and Professor Löbler is saying that I didn't want to mean any disrespect, by the way. Here first, we're just using your first name. It's the use of language that makes yes. Now, it just means that we have to think about this, what Professor Löbler said, that whatever we teach, something else goes home. And that means that we just can't go out and say you have to change in this way. It has to be done in other ways. It needs other pedagogical approaches also in relation to businesses, to business practitioners and so forth. And it all starts in universities, because that's where the new generation is growing up. That's you.
Yeah, of course.
I also would like to give an answer to that, because I'm very much engaged also in executive education, and I'm teaching executives for more than 17 years now, and regularly. And when I try to interpret this, what is happening in a nasty, logic way, so to say, I can see that we change the resources of these managers. They learn something, they see something, they understand something about what is happening in business, what is happening in marketing and selling. And what we learn is that a lot of those go back to their companies, and they see that they are new, that change resources do not fit anymore with the resources of their companies, and they leave the company. And they say, I have enough. I've learned so much about what is happening, and I see that I'm not able to do this in my company, and I have two options. One is to leave the company or to change the company. And sometimes you're not able to change the company, so they leave the company. This is not what we are telling to the HR people of these companies, because they wouldn't send us these participants anymore to our programs. And we want to sell the program. So, but in many cases, the most successful ones are those who change, who switch to another company, and this is, I think, is something that can be very well seen through this lens, that you see there are different resources, changed resources, and they do not fit in a way, and they are not creating value anymore together. So they have to look for new opportunities to create value in a different setting. And on the other hand, there are a lot of good examples, of successful examples. There are successful companies and people doing good HR work and bringing these things together. So I think it's not only a question for younger people of teaching especially, or those coming directly from the university, but also in further education. There's an ongoing process, and every time we have to think about what we can do in this sense.
Johann Wolfgang Goethe said that if every small child would grow up in the way as it already appears, we had only geniuses. And if you remember, children under the age of 5, they have a lot of wonderful, boring questions, which is their desire to learn. And then they come to school, and at school, we totally have a good dominant logic, because we think we have to produce something out of these resources. But we don't co-create value, because if you ask children what they are able to do, if you ask them, well, can you draw a picture? They say, yes, of course. Can you sing a song? Yes, of course. Can you fly? Yes, in my imagination. They can everything. If you ask young students coming out of school, and if you ask them, what you can? Well, I cannot sing, I cannot French, I cannot draw, I can nothing. So in school you learn what you're not able to do. And if we would change school from a service dominant logic to co-create the value these young people bring to school with all their question, I think we could change the whole education process in Germany, which I would like very much, because the potential is there. But I think we streamline all the young people, and that is the biggest fault we can ever make.
I actually think you said that pretty well. So I'll just echo that. I think SD logic allows us to be children again, in sort of a real sense. If you think about what paradigms do, they provide a coordinating function. They allow us to communicate and think and work together in certain ways, but they do it at the expense of limiting our ability to see and do and think in other ways. It's always a double-edged sword when we enter paradigmatic thought. And there's probably no stronger paradigm in the business world than goods dominant logic, which limits our ability to be creative. And so what I think SD logic does is really allows possibilities. It allows us to free up that maybe we're not about manufacturing primarily. Maybe we're really about connecting with other people. Maybe the primary function of the firm is something closer to marketing, and maybe if we need manufacturing, it's somewhat incidental, or it can be outsourced. It doesn't have to be something that we develop internal to the firm. It allows us to think about selling service flows instead of selling stuff. Imagine the impact that has on sustainability issues and other things that people are interested in now. And I can go on, but it just opens up endless possibilities of things we can do, ways we can innovate, ways we can interact with the market in profitable ways for us that lots of other people probably don't see, that are constricted by goods logic.
Okay, thank you. Sven Pastowski?
Well, thanks for the very interesting presentations. I've been a student at Bayreuth University. I did my PhD at the Services Management chair, and I'm now working for the Adidas Group, shoes. So we are talking consumer goods, 300 million pairs of shoes a year. And I came into that company based in Nuremberg. It's a German company. And I was told we are not a production company, we are a marketing company. And I understand that, and explaining that from the service dominant logic, it makes absolutely sense to me. We have outsourced nearly all of our production. We are coordinating production. We are trying to find out what the consumer needs at the very end. What the customer needs, our retailer, what the consumer needs. And just maybe to add to your question, when I came in there, they asked me more or less, well, from services management, what do you want in a consumer goods company? It took 4.5 years by now. Yes, we are still producing running shoes, but what we what we are on the way to sell to the consumer at the very end is, if you want to run the Boston Marathon, you need a plane ticket, you need a personal trainer, you need a training plan to get there. And by the way, good shoes would help. So what we sell is the whole bundle of the whole thing. And we try to get the consumer to the point to fulfill his wish to run the Boston Marathon or the Ironman on Hawaii or whatever. So it might take time in the industry, and the industry is wild out there. I've noticed that a lot of times. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to add this. Even if we are a strict, pure consumer goods industry, we do deliver something to the consumer, which we see from the services management point of view. He can individualize his shoes, get the running shoe in red, green, yellow, put the name of the girlfriend or of the baby or whatever on top of it, so he gets more than just a running shoe. But what we see, and this is what I take out from the coordinative aspect, what we need, very special, we run in a 6-month calendar for the product, for winter, spring, summer, for winter, spring, summer. So what we have to do is coordinate everything in projects and in project teams. And what we get from university students starting with us, there's a whole lack of project management. And you need the project management to define who do I have to talk to, what do I have to do, and how to coordinate all those different understandings, all those different aspects, all those different ways of how to get the best product or the best solution for something for the consumer. So I think project management is very essential to coordinate everything.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to reply to that?
No, I'm not in the target group of you, but it's, I'm not in your target group. I don't want to run it. but I agree, nevertheless.
You know, I might add that I think your project management reference is really very, very important, because it's a matter of coordinating a number of various activities that traditionally are taken care of by different departments, different people, and not in a very coordinated way. Yes.
When I was 20, I had a love affair with an Adidas shoe, really. It was a pair of Adidas shoes, and I loved them really. They were more of value. They were a part of me. So that was a love affair. Think about these shoes being love affairs for your customer.
I think this is a good idea for the managers at Adidas. So keep it in mind, Sven. The next question comes from Professor Eimann, please.
Yeah, so my question does not relate to what I'm doing. So I'm a professor of information systems management, so we will hopefully talk about technology later. But for the moment now, I would like to stress a little bit on the point of the paradigm you're all having in your mind, probably. There is a seminal example from Thomas Kuhn's book about the paradigm shift from phlogiston theory to oxygen theory. Probably you all know a little bit on that. The point in that is that was not really a hard break between things, because phlogiston theory was very useful. It was used for coordination, because it was a theory that explained to people a little bit how to run a steel mill. So how to fire up the coal, how it worked that iron became steel, and what happened in the chemical process. The point is that the whole theory was completely wrong, but it served a purpose. And phlogiston theory, according to Kuhn's book, was used 150 years after oxygen was discovered. That means that if you now talk about a paradigm shift even if you talk about goods dominant logic versus service dominant logics, it might be that these are two sides that might coexist for 100 or 150 years. Now the question would be is there any chance to say which theory is true and which is not. Like at some point in time you could do for oxygen theory versus phlogiston theory. You could say that one was true and the other was false. Is that possible here? And the second one is then, of course, a little bit latent. If you're now teaching people in service-dominant logic, is that then confusing their minds because they are using words from goods-dominant logic, both and service-dominant logic, so they keep up, so they are mixing the semantics of both, which might end up in a complete confusion.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think Helgi wants to
yes,
desperately answer this question.
So now I really thank you for that question. Feel deeply involved in that paradigm thing. And what I remember from the 5th chapter, I think, in Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, was when he explained the word paradigm, and that is very important from my perspective, he referred to Ludwig Wittgenstein in the sense of language games, as well as to Michael Polanyi in making clear that these paradigms are implicit. Okay? The tacit knowledge idea of Michael Polanyi. So if we go back to that, we figure out that the most of our paradigms we use are not explicit, first of all, which we have to reflect upon. If we come out to make it more explicit, then they are more clear, and then we can figure out how they are. And well, I would never say a paradigm is true or not true. I would say a paradigm is an implicit convention which works for the people who are agreeing to it. And that's it, even in natural science. And is teaching service-dominant logic confusing? Well, I hope that all teaching is confusing, because otherwise you cannot learn. If the students are not rethinking, rearranging their thoughts, and they do it only if they are confused in some sense. If they take only the old stuff, they wouldn't establish new thoughts. So if we don't confuse students, then they cannot rechange their ideas and their patterns and their behavior. So I hope the teaching service-dominant logic is confusing.
There are actually about 4 questions in there, or at least 4 questions in there, and I don't know if I'll address all of them, but I'll give it a quick shot. My take on paradigms is no, they don't happen abruptly. They kind of seep in, and they seep in from different places. And I think an important part of SD logic is that, sort of as I said, it didn't come about because Bob and I sat down and decided to huddle and make up a new theory. That it happened because we did lots of reading in lots of areas. And what we found was some commonalities in those. And we tried to find the points of convergence of those commonalities and see if we could move it ahead a bit. So we're trying to participate in a shift rather than creating a shift, I think is the way that we would phrase it. Coexistence of paradigms, maybe. I think it's more likely that what happens is that if there is a new paradigm, we haven't claimed a new paradigm. Some others have, we have not. But if SDL becomes a new paradigm, it's probably because it transcends some existing ones. So it doesn't replace, but it allows, and goods logic probably still has a place in SD logic. It's probably a limited case of a more general case, and I would think that's how we would view it. The truth, no, I don't think you can prove frameworks like paradigms. You can only establish their usefulness, and I think the hallmark of goods logic is that we keep finding where it's not useful, and that's why we have these sort of splintered things going on in lots of places that Bob and I and others have thought that we noticed, and that's the convergence we're looking for. There is a real problem that you point out in language, but we've got 2 choices. We can use the language of business and try to carefully select the words that fit best and redefine a few that are consistent. So our definition of service is actually very consistent with a dictionary definition of service. The business definition of services is actually the inconsistency. So we just went back to what really makes sense. What I mean, using my resources for someone else's benefit sounds pretty much like service to me. And so coming up with a different word doesn't help much. We're still talking about the same thing. But the words do cause us problems because they carry baggage. So we can try to make up our own. Richard Norman is famous for making up words like bundability and unbundability and liquefaction of information. And they're great because they're freed of the baggage. But nobody knows what the hell he's talking about. And so it doesn't do us much good when we try to use those terms. We have to stop and explain what all of them mean. And so it's a real problem. And we've commented on a number of times. One of the real stumbling blocks we have in trying to work with SDL is finding the right language to communicate with.
Yeah. I think those of you who have already read some of the articles should have noticed this, because there are already a number of articles where you basically explain what you talk about.
Yeah.
So Michael.
Yeah, I just want to add that I made really completely the same experience in Germany. It's the same. When we started in the mid-90s to say it makes no sense to talk about goods and services because you cannot distinguish between, let's talk about something different. And we did it with practitioners twice or 3 times or 4 times, and always we met, they do not understand anything. So in the end, I ended up with saying, I will not compete against the Duden. I will not fight the Duden. So now today I'm teaching Dienstleistungsmarketing, services marketing, but I'm not really talking about Dienstleistungsmarketing. And this is a just undercover way of approach. And this is something the same with what Steve said. We don't have the right words, or maybe we're inventing new words, but nobody uses it. So we have to think about how we can bring these topics with the old words. This is a little bit difficult sometimes and frustrating sometimes, but I think this is a way of service marketing science. Something to how to promote those things to other people, to teach them and to bring it into the community.
Could I add something to the teaching part of your question? Well, again, referring to Professor Lebler here, I don't think one can teach anything. One can just state some facts or ideas, and then the other party will put it in the perspective that is in the mind, and the perspective perhaps changes slowly. So the main thing I'm teaching back home in Finland, universities and businesses, is service logic. We call it service management, service marketing, service and relationship marketing, or something that's appropriate. And I would never lecture like I did here to begin with, but only after a number of sessions with discussions with the group to really make sure that everybody has an opportunity to go through the coordination process, at least to some extent, so that we know that production now doesn't mean producing an output. Production means something more extended, and productivity doesn't mean output over input. It means something different in a service context, and so on and so forth. So I have to be very careful with the teaching aspect, otherwise it just goes wrong. That's my experience, at least. As to different paradigms at the same time, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question was from Monica Salmon.
I wanted to ask, a lot of things you say with the service dominant logic is more about, for example, like he told, I have a shoe, how can I take service and make a lot of a new experience? But what about companies who provide service? Do they have to learn something? Is there really something they can do better? Is there really something the service dominant logic can provide for them? Because we are a service management chair here.
May I start? The answer, in my experience, is definitely yes. Because my experience from service firms up from the northern parts of Europe, mainly, but I've seen it in other places as well, is that the so-called pure service firms, like a restaurant or a bank or other financial institute, transportation firm, whatever, they're desperately trying to get away from a service logic and get into a goods logic. And the reason for that is that they believe that the goods is the norm, and it's much easier to communicate internally, externally, if you have squeezed down your service into a neatly packaged something that has removed all flexibility, and they call it in Finland, they call it productization. I don't know if you use that word here, and everybody talks about productization. It has to be done in order to be able to market services properly, say, and that is to destroy the sources of a competitive advantage of service, which is exactly flexibility. You have in other ways you have to try to cope with the problems of having a set of resources, tangible or intangible, that you must be able to communicate and handle and manage and all those things. So yes, so-called pure service firms, in my experience, definitely have to learn, and even more than manufacturing firms, I would really say, because it's so, I don't know, it's bad to see how they are behaving.
I think you always can only learn if things are different than they were before. So in that sense, if service terminology is somehow different, it's interesting to think about that and to think about how it is different and what we can make out of it. Having said that, I would also say, well, if we look at service terminology, what is it? It is nothing, we could say. Sorry for that, I come. But it's only words on papers. And it's thoughts and experience in the authors of these papers. That is the most important part, I think. But what we do if we read these papers, we can reconstruct our thoughts by using their words. And that makes the change, and that makes the learning, and that makes the different. So in that sense, it's always valuable to talk to people who think different. And that is why I like to be a professor. I always talk to people who are different, then I can learn. If I talk to people who think the same way, like I cannot learn. So in that sense, people can learn a lot by using the service terminology.
Could Christian just... Okay.
If you want.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. All right. Yeah, I could build on that because, you know, talking to practitioners, quite often I get the feedback that the problem is the word service here, because that confuses us. We know what service is. Service, confusing it with service activity, and now service logic, service dominant logic, or like that. They just can't. Why don't you call it value creation logic? Somebody said. Others say it's customer logic to me. Why don't you call it that? And I think they're right in that sense, that service is the problematic word. Now, we all come from service research at some point. And hence we fallen in love with, I'm sorry, English on my third language, I have to think sometimes. Fallen in love with the word service. But it would have been better off if we had taken a total new start and not talked about service logic, but something else, perhaps. But now we're here, and I guess we have to continue on this path.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of what I said a while ago. We can call it Fred, but once you explain what it is, it kind of means the dictionary definition of service. And so we've still got to get back there somehow. Yeah. We could call it value, but goods logic, those adherents to goods logic think they're talking about value. They just have a different meaning of value. It's embedded in stuff instead of something that is co-created or the customer's involved in. The notion that service firms, or more likely what you're talking about are services firms, by traditional classifications, are good at service is probably the fallacy in that thinking. We teach, sort of has already been said, we teach goods logic to service firm CEOs just as much as we do to manufacturers. And academics are some of the worst at doing that. We've developed these IHIP characteristics, which are really the bad characteristics of services inseparability and intangibility, those characteristics. And we teach in every one of our service textbooks, except Christians, how to make these services more goods-like. So get rid of the problem that it's intangible. How to give tangible evidence, I think is the term. And how to do these things so that our services appear to be more standardized and more like goods. We're part of the culprits in that. And the exception has actually been Christians' textbooks, which has never done that, to the best of my knowledge.
I think you're very happy with this answer now.
I'm really proud of that, yes. I never used the IHIB, I only used just that from it that seems to still fit, plus a few other things. Yeah.
All right.
Basically process.
Any more questions? Yeah. Professor Eimann again. No problem.
Last week, okay, if it's needed. Okay, last week was a large conference in Nuremberg from German academics in business and management, and the title was about service management. And the funny thing there was that I've been able to grab a copy of something called the Dienstleistungs Innovation, Service Innovation of the German Federal Ministry. And it showed several examples of good service businesses in several sections. The sections were titled, for example, service innovation, service engineering, service standardization. There we are again, which sounds a little bit like taking product innovation and saying, now we have service innovation, then you have product engineering, then we have service engineering, and so forth. So it's a one-to-one copy of products to some sense. That together with the observation, for example, productization, so that you have services being somehow molded into technology. The most infamous one is probably the railway ticket machine from the Deutsche Bahn, which is a service turned into a machine. So does that tell us a story that in principle you see the possibilities of service, but you always come down to the thing you know best, that is a product, a tangible one, and you don't want to get too much away from that.
I believe this is that has nothing to do with that. It's just on the spending of money of the Federal Republic of Germany. Because before we had this program, we had a program which was for engineers, and suddenly we saw 70% of the German economy is done in services and not in production anymore. So the engineers who get a huge amount of money from the federal government get scared that they wouldn't get so much money anymore. So they had to change the name of the program to get the money. And they said, now we are the experts for services. And they invented service engineering and all those things. And I think that some of the things that Bernd Staus already said 10 years ago is that the worst thing you can do is to give services to engineers. But this is happening now. And so you see, if you look in this book and you go to the conference, I always run out crying. Yeah.
No, but there's really, and there's been all the time, there's been service, modern service, as I said, the same thing. There's a lot of academics that, even from the management point of view, that don't see really what it's all about, but that try just to squeeze a traditional, very goods-based either model or concept or term into a service context, and that is not going the right way. But then we have this problem with putting a service in the hands of engineers. It doesn't have to be bad, but it's easily easy, is that. And the service science here was mentioned earlier, and it has real potential, the idea of service. The problem seems to be that it's the engineers who are jumping at it throughout the world and making service engineering out of it. And as much as I've seen about that, very rarely the customer is mentioned. In their model, the customer doesn't exist. Not even the employee exists very often in those models. And I'm afraid that the whole service science initiative will go overboard very soon here those who come from service management don't get a real grip on the engineers as well, so they really integrate or coordinate their language, their use and their thinking here. Because there's so much potential in the idea of service science, but as it seems to go now worldwide, and I've seen it not only in Europe, but also in China, for example, where I attended a workshop arranged by the Chinese National and Natural Something Society for Research, and there were 50 participants. And there was one Chinese, all professor who come from the management part, and I who was the only outsider. The rest were from engineering schools and engineers. So it's all over the world, it goes that way. And they all, there too, they just talk engineering stuff. So there's so much potential, but the risk that it will go wrong are so high.
Well, that is an interesting discussion. If I observe that, there are some people who claim that some terms are in the wrong or right hands. But it's an interesting point here, in being aware that the other hands, people use the terms as they think it is the right way to use them, and we use it different, yes. And I would agree that I would prefer it to use the way we discussed it already. But that is what makes science going on, that we have different opinions about terms and things, and that we have to have a discourse about that. And if we are able to convince the others, that's fine. And if we are not, we have to rethink, or even to put more effort into convincing them, to remind them on the books where you find the easy words of service and so on. But I think the very appealing thing in social constructionism is to agree that different people are allowed to have different thoughts and different ideas of words. And we have to coordinate together the meaning of these words.
Except they get the money for it.
Well, yes, well, that is politics.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Yeah. Bastian. Just need a microphone.
So I assume, and I think you're on the right way, there's the logic, but where do you see the success factors or the impact factors of the success of the SDL of the past, and where do you see the impact factors of the success for the future, for especially regarding the practitioners? So just to sum it up, what made it that special?
I give you, well, maybe one or two examples. The first one is a farmer in the North Denmark area in the north of Copenhagen. And he has a farm with hens and he's selling eggs, regular eggs. You wonder, well, what does it have to do with service dominant logic? I think a lot, because these eggs are typically sold to 25 euro cents. But he sells these eggs for 75 euro cents. How does he do that? Well, he just opens up the opportunity for the customer to collect these eggs themselves. So they have to go to the hens and to pick up the eggs from directly where the hens plop them down. And that is, but these people coming from the urban areas want to experience real countryside of life. And they pay for it. And that is an extension of their experience. And these people co-create value, and they pay for this co-creation of value. I think this is an example for service dominant logic and for a successful application of it.
Now this sounds very goods-oriented, because with looking at the good and letting the customer in. However, it is very much based on a service logic, because the idea was to find a market, the segment of customers whose life path and everyday practice life is supported by the opportunity to go there to a real farm and pick the eggs. I have an example from exactly the opposite. In Finland, I guess it's somewhere else in other countries as well. Somebody renting vans. The normal way of renting vans or cars is, hey, you come here, you make the agreement, and you come here and pick up the van, and you bring it back to us or some other of our locations. I got the idea that to support some customers' life path who want to move something is that make it easier possible to start moving things. So we'll deliver the van to your location, and wherever you then leave your van, let us know when we pick it up. And that is exactly the contrary seen on the surface. That looks really service-based, whereas your example looked very goods-based. But both are very service logic-based because the starting point is not goods, not service, it's the customer. Customers' everyday processes, their life path, or in a business-to-business, their business process. And I think that is the big idea with here, that the service logic makes thinking customer-centric, whereas goods logic, as Steve pointed out in his presentation, the customer centricity is only an add-on there, and doesn't sometimes works well and sometimes doesn't work very well at all. And I see this connection between the service logic thinking and true customer centricity that really is there. If one understands service logic as I think it should be understood, and probably we all think it should be understood that way.
Can I ask you a question which is closely related to what you just said? You said customer centricity is one of the important points of service or service dominant logic. And in your presentation, you also mentioned that there's some homework to be done before, and you have to understand how customers are using your things, or how they make use, or how they create value of what they get from you. Do you think this means that we need another approach to market research as well to get this understanding, or do we need other tools? Because what we are doing up to now mostly is we try to understand how buying decisions are made, but we usually not try to understand what consumers or what our customer firms are doing with what they get from us. So usually the market research ends at a point when cash is paid for something, and after that we usually don't care anymore.
Thank you for that question. I think market research, as I see it, probably in Germany as well, is so conservative, so old-fashioned, so misplaced these days, so directed towards trying to understand the wrong things, only partly the right things, as a foundation for doing good business, for good marketing. We, as you said, we're interested in the buying situation and then in customer needs. Now, good salespeople know customers don't know their needs very well. So why should we be interested in asking about customers' needs? Just because somebody sometimes put it in a textbook, I guess, like the IHIP, you know. And everybody's been quoting that, and then market research companies are trying to ask about needs, and users of market research wants to know about needs. I think that really there's a huge reinvention of market research needed, and we see the signs of it already, going more towards an anthropological way of approaching it, living with the customer as it is. I mean, not living with the tribe in the Amazonas for 1 year and then coming back and tell about them, but trying one way or the other, however you can do it, live with the customer. It could be observation, could even be just focus groups, or could be going further than that, and a variety of ways to find out really three things, I think. One is the customer practices, meaning what are they doing, why are they doing what they are doing, what do they want to accomplish what they're doing, are they accomplishing very well what they want to accomplish by the way they are doing what they are doing. You know, this we need to know. Then we need to know what are the value systems. I mean, your values, what do they accept in life and what do they do not accept in life. Then we know something about what they need. Only then. And this can never be obtained, this information, through surveys, for example. Not even through telephone interviews. Not even through normal standardized face-to-face interviews. Not even through normal open face or open-ended interviews. We need to go much further there and to understand what do we really need to know about the customers so that we can develop our business in a good way, quite regardless of whether we are basing our business models on a service logic or a goods logic or any other logic. Thank you for that question.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your answer.
Well, I think we're reaching the end of the time we have, but to maybe a little bit sum up this discussion, allow me to just ask one more question to all of you, and that is, yeah, some of you mentioned it already in the presentations. One of the questions that remains for service-dominant logic is where will it take us? So in some sense. So I would be interested, what do you think, what should be the next step to further develop service-dominant logic? Is it necessary at all, or do we have enough already? Or is the next step to convince more practitioners to use it, or is the next step more to develop the theory? What do you think? Or is it both? Or none of it?
Well, I would say for me, it's an evolutionary process, and in an evolutionary process, you never know what comes out, but it depends on what we do. And so I think we have started to discuss these issues. We have presented it to you. You have started to think about that, and that is how it develops, how the evolution takes place. And what comes out, we will see, and then we can figure out whether we have to refine, to redesign it, and so on. And then we have to put it somehow down so that we can use it. And I think that is possible, that is very much possible, and we can even figure out companies which do it implicitly or intuitively, and we can do it more explicit. But I think we are, for me, I think the SDL is, for me, the best candidate to become a new paradigm in marketing, so to put it this way. And I think, but we still have to work a lot on that, because we have somehow these kind of backfalls where these things fall into wrong hands.
No, I agree with your final comment on that. It has the potential, perhaps the best potential, to become the reinvention of marketing that is so desperately required as a new marketing theory. Well, just remember, the empire strikes back. The empire will tell. The empire is those who have the vested interest in universities, in traditional marketing theories, views of the life, and in business practice have a vested interest in. This is the way we always have been thinking, and this is the way we are improving our thinking, but within this box, between this that's good dominant logic. So we're still a minority. We're fighting an uphill battle, but we may get up somewhere so we can start to move further. But we also remember this as Professor Varga said, it didn't start this with their article. The modern service logic development started in France in the early 1970s with Eric Blanchard and Pierre Aiglier. And from there moved to the Nordic countries, Finland and Sweden, basically, and then to the United States in the mid-70s, and then in the 80s to Germany and other countries. So it has still fairly long roots, not as long as economics, not as long as goods-based management models, but it has fairly long roots, but it's not there. It has, of course, to be developed further. And then we must remember that it's not straightforward. Like the van renting example versus the egg picking example. So what looks contrary to service logic is exactly according to the service logic, because it's starting from understanding the customer's practices and their life path and business process. That's the key thing. And then it may look very different, the business model that is developed. I think one thing that is required is metrics, to develop metrics, to try to admit. But metrics cannot be developed first and theory then. Theory has to be developed first, then we know what to measure, so then we can develop metrics. And now I think we are in a way that at least we have started in a business-to-business setting to develop some metrics to be used here. But it's been a very interesting discussion and very good questions from the moderator and from you in the audience. Thank you very much for letting me be involved here.
Thank you for being here for the presentation and the discussion, of course, and for your competent answers.
One correction, I think Christian had it partially right when he said some of the service movement began in France. Part of it began when a French economist actually said that services are exchanged for services, and once we fully understand this, we have the beginning and the middle and the end of economic science. That was Frederick Bastiat in 1848.
But I said modern service research.
Well, modern is a relative term.
Well, that was my definition of relativism in this context.
And if you trace it, which I have, if you really trace the history of the treatment of service back, really back far, what you find is that goods logic is sort of an aberration and a sort of a detour that we took beginning with the Industrial Revolution and with Smith's work. That if you think about it, we didn't invent service recently. If you went to get a suit of clothes 250 years ago, you went to a tailor, and we would still classify that as service. We moved that to the factory and mass-produced them, and we call it manufacturing. Still, if you go to the tailor, we call it service. It's just this other stuff is off to the side, and we've sort of missed where that came from. And as I said, modern is fairly relative. And so if you look long enough, you see a very different picture. As for where I see this going, I don't know how to make an end to open source. I don't know how to announce that it's over. Open source sort of announces its own end by definition. And so I think what we've tried to do is repeatedly claim that we don't own this, that we're trying to capture something, and Bob and I do about 25 plus talks a year, some of them fairly major audiences, and Bob does some comparable number. And what we're trying to do is talk to people doing different things, and academics and practitioners, and invite people in. Everybody's got their specialty, and let them run in that direction. And we try to listen closely as they correct us or have input or new ideas. And the intersubjective notions, for instance, that Helge has a real influence on my thinking recently. So it's an ongoing, alive process, and I think that's the way it should be, and I don't know how to find an end to that. Where I'm going personally, my real interest is the intrigue with the idea that we teach marketing, but we don't have a theory of the market. Just think about that. It's sort of like we're missing our basic theory that we need to teach people how to do what it is that people... So usually you do an applied science from a basic science, but we don't quite have the basic science. We thought we had it with economics, but it turns out to be the wrong set of notions for doing marketing. We're trying to do just the opposite, make things not be commodities. And so we have to stop and rethink that. And so my real efforts right now are how to use SD logic to develop a theory of the market on which we might base a better general theory of marketing.
I think that's a very good final word for this discussion.